Sweat beaded on Grace Thompson's palms as she clutched her AP chemistry exam, the red ink bleeding across her perfect calculations like wounds. 15 and overlooked in Whitmore Academy's pristine hallways, her mind blazed with molecular formulas while Dr. Cartwright's sneer cut through her confidence. Interesting approach, Miss Thompson. Where exactly did you learn these advanced techniques? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The classroom fell silent. Grace's heart hammered against her ribs as she stood there, her dark braids catching the fluorescent light, surrounded by the polished faces of her classmates. Yesterday she'd been Whitmore's golden student, her chemistry prowess earning whispers of early MIT admission. Today, Dr. Helen Cartwright's cold blue eyes held something sharper than academic scrutiny. "I studied the textbook, Dr. Cartwright," Grace said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. "Chapter 12 covers these reaction pathways." Cartwright's smile was thin as a blade. "Of course, though one wonders how a student manages to employ graduate-level analysis without proper instruction." Her paws stretched like a noose. "Perhaps we should discuss the importance of citing sources properly." Grace's stomach twisted. She'd aced this exam, every equation balanced, every mechanism drawn with precision that would make her physicist father proud. But here it was, bleeding red corrections for imaginary errors, marked with a B- that felt like a slap. Jessica Chen, her lab partner, shifted uncomfortably in the front row, her dark eyes darting between Grace and their teacher. She'd seen Grace work, knew the brilliance that flowed from her fingertips like water. But Jessica's mouth stayed closed, her witness silenced by the institutional weight of Whitmore's expectations. The bell rang, its shrill cry cutting through the tension. Students scattered like leaves, backpacks rustling, voices dropping to whispers. Grace remained frozen, the exam paper crumpled in her grip. "Miss Thompson." Cartwright's voice stopped her cold. A word. Grace approached the desk where Cartwright sat like a queen on her throne, 20 years of Whitmore tradition backing her authority. Her older woman's fingers drummed against grade sheets, each tap a countdown. "Your work shows promise," Cartwright began, her tone suggesting the opposite. "But promise without proper foundation crumbles. I've seen too many students reach beyond their capabilities." Her eyes bore into Grace's. "I'd hate to see you set yourself up for disappointment." The words hit like ice water. Grace had never failed at chemistry, never struggled with concepts that sang to her soul like music. But doubt crept in, insidious as poison. "I understand," Grace whispered, though she understood nothing. She walked through Whitmore's marble halls in a daze, past portraits of distinguished alumni whose eyes seemed to judge her passing. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "How was the exam, sweetheart?" Grace stared at the screen, fingers hovering. How could she explain the inexplicable, that her triumph had become her trial, her excellence somehow suspect? "Fine," she typed back, the lie bitter on her tongue. Outside, autumn leaves danced in the Massachusetts wind, and Grace pulled her blazer tighter. Whitmore Academy stood like a fortress behind her, its red brick walls hiding secrets she was only beginning to glimpse. Dr. Cartwright's words echoed in her mind, planting seeds of doubt in soil that had never known failure. Something was wrong, but Grace couldn't name it yet. The lab report lay on Grace's desk like a death sentence, its pages scarred with red ink and cruel commentary. 2 weeks had passed since the exam incident, and Dr. Cartwright's campaign had intensified with surgical precision. "Methodology lacks sophistication," read one comment, scrolled across Grace's flawless titration analysis. "Conclusions drawn without proper theoretical foundation," marked another despite Grace having cited 3 peer-reviewed journals. Grace's hands trembled as she read each critique, her confidence hemorrhaging with every dismissive word. Across the lab bench, she watched Sarah Hendricks, blonde, privileged, Cartwright's obvious favorite, receive praise for work that paled next to Grace's own. "Excellent intuition, Miss Hendricks," Cartwright announced that morning, holding up Sarah's report like a banner. "This demonstrates the kind of sophisticated thinking we expected Whitmore." The methodology was identical to Grace's, the same textbook references, the same analytical approach, but Sarah's earned an A- while Grace's bled with criticism. Jessica Chen slid into the seat beside her, notebook clutched against her chest like armor. "Grace," she whispered, glancing around the bustling lab, "this isn't right. Your work is always—" "Don't." Grace's voice cut sharper than she intended.
She couldn't bear sympathy, not when Cartwright's words burrowed deeper each day, making her question everything she'd believed about her abilities. Maybe she was reaching beyond her grasp. Maybe her understanding was shallow, built on quicksand rather than bedrock. That evening, parent night brought Dr. James and Dr. Sarah Thompson to Whitmore's hallowed halls. Grace watched from the library as her parents navigated the reception, her father's physics credentials and her mother's surgical expertise, making them formidable figures among the wine and cheese. But when they met with Cartwright, Grace saw something shift in her parents' expressions. Through the conference room's glass walls, she watched her teacher lean forward, voice low and confident. "Grace shows potential," Cartwright was saying, when Grace pressed closer to eavesdrop. "But I worry she's been overpraised in her previous educational settings. Sometimes students from certain backgrounds need more structured guidance to truly excel." The phrase hung in the air like smoke. Certain backgrounds. Grace's blood ran cold. Her father's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but he maintained his diplomatic composure. "Grace has always demonstrated exceptional aptitude in the sciences." "Of course," Cartwright smiled. "I'm simply ensuring she develops proper analytical rigor. We can't allow natural enthusiasm to substitute for methodological precision." Later, in their BMW's leather interior, Grace's parents exchanged glances she couldn't read. "Challenging teacher," her mother said carefully. "Rigorous," her father agreed. "Grace, you'll need to work harder to meet her standards." The words hit Grace like physical blows. Even her parents, her brilliant, accomplished parents, were beginning to believe. The doubt that had been planted was growing, fed by Cartwright's subtle manipulations and institutional authority. That night, Grace sat at her desk until 3 a.m., rewriting lab reports that were already perfect, polishing prose that gleamed like diamonds. Every word choice became agony, every citation a desperate attempt to prove worthiness she'd never had to question before. Miss Angela Rodriguez, the young chemistry teacher who taught the regular sections, found Grace crying in the supply closet the next afternoon. "Hey," Rodriguez said softly, her brown eyes kind. "Grace, what's wrong?" Grace wiped her face, embarrassed by the tears. "Nothing. I'm fine." But Rodriguez's gaze lingered on the crumpled test in Grace's hands, another perfect score marked down to mediocrity. The young teacher's expression grew troubled, recognition flickering across her features. "Grace," she said carefully, "if you ever need someone to talk to—" But Grace was already fleeing, her footsteps echoing through empty hallways. She couldn't accept help when she didn't understand what was happening to her. All she knew was that everything she'd believed about herself was crumbling, one red mark at a time. Cartwright's shadow grew longer each day, reaching into Grace's dreams, poisoning her passion for the subject that had once brought her joy. The trap was closing, and Grace didn't even realize she was prey. The failing grade stared back at Grace like a judgment from on high, the red F carved in her chemistry test like a scar across her soul. She sat in the bathroom stall, legs pulled up to avoid detection, and tried to understand how her world had collapsed so completely. 3 months into junior year, and Grace Thompson, valedictorian material, MIT hopeful, chemistry prodigy, was failing AP chemistry. The irony would have been laughable if it wasn't destroying her. Her hand shook as she reviewed the test questions she had answered perfectly: molecular orbital theory, thermodynamic calculations, organic reaction mechanisms, all concepts she could explain in her sleep. Yet Cartwright's feedback suggested she understood nothing. "Fundamental misunderstanding of basic principles," read one comment. "Lacks conceptual foundation necessary for advanced work," read another. Each word a dagger twisting deeper. Her phone buzzed with a text from her father. "How did the test go, sweetheart?" She stared at the message until the letters blurred. How could she tell him that she was failing the subject he had helped her fall in love with? How could she admit that maybe she wasn't as smart as they all had believed? The bathroom door creaked open, and Jessica Chen's voice drifted through. "Grace, I know you're in here." Grace pulled her feet higher, but Jessica's Converse sneakers appeared under the stall door. "I can see your shoes," Jessica said gently. "Come on, talk to me." Grace emerged, her eyes red-rimmed and her pride in tatters. Jessica took one look at the failing test and her face hardened with an anger Grace had never seen before.
"This is bullshit," Jessica said, her quiet demeanor cracking. "Grace, your work is graduate level. I've seen you solve problems that make my head spin. This," she gestured at the paper, "this is wrong." "Maybe I've been fooling myself," Grace whispered. "Maybe I don't belong here." "Don't you dare," Jessica gripped her shoulders. "Don't let her do this to you. I've watched Cartwright for 3 years, Grace. She doesn't grade you the same as everyone else. She doesn't even look at your work the same way." The words hung between them, dangerous and electric. They both knew what Jessica was implying, but neither dared say it aloud. "You're just being a good friend," Grace said weakly. "Am I? Then explain why Michael Henderson got an A on work that was half as thorough as yours. Explain why Sarah Hendricks gets praise for theories you explained to her during study group." Grace wanted to argue, to defend the system that was crushing her, but the evidence was overwhelming. She'd watched it happen, normalized the impossible standards, internalized the criticism until she believed it was deserved. "I need to try harder," Grace said, but the words felt hollow. She stumbled through the rest of the day in a fog, her confidence a ghost of its former self. In calculus, she stared at derivatives she could solve blindfolded, but couldn't muster the energy to care. In AP history, she let discussions of civil rights pass without comment, too broken to see the parallels to her own experience. The final blow came during last period when she overheard 2 seniors talking by their lockers. "Did you hear Grace Thompson is failing chemistry?" one said. "I guess she wasn't as smart as everyone thought." "Affirmative action admits," the other replied with a shrug. "They always crash eventually." Grace fled to the parking lot, her breath coming in gasps. She sat in her car for 20 minutes, engine running, unable to face the drive home, unable to face her parents' questions, her siblings' expectations, her own reflection in the mirror. When she finally arrived home, she found her mother in the kitchen, still in scrubs from her shift at Boston Children's Hospital. "How was school, baby?" Dr. Sarah Thompson asked, looking up from her medical journals. Grace opened her mouth to lie, to maintain the facade, but instead a sob escaped. Her mother was beside her instantly, surgeon's hands gentle as they pulled her close. "I'm failing," Grace whispered into her mother's shoulder. "I'm failing chemistry, and I don't understand why." Sarah Thompson held her daughter tighter, her analytical mind already working. In 15 years of motherhood, she'd never seen Grace struggle academically, never seen her question her own abilities. "Tell me everything," she said quietly. So Grace did. She spilled 3 months of accumulated hurt, confusion, and self-doubt. She showed her mother the tests, the lab reports, the steady decline in grades despite her unwavering effort. Sarah Thompson's expression grew darker with each piece of evidence. When Grace finished, silence stretched between them like a held breath. "Baby," her mother said carefully, "I think we need to call your father." That night, as Grace lay in bed staring at the ceiling, she could hear her parents' voices drifting up from downstairs, low, urgent, angry. She caught fragments, pattern, bias, my daughter, before exhaustion finally claimed her. In her dreams, she stood in an empty chemistry lab, equations dancing around her like mocking spirits. She reached for them, tried to grasp the knowledge that had once been hers, but they dissolved at her touch,
leaving her with nothing but the echo of Cartwright's voice. "Perhaps you're not as capable as you believed." Grace woke with tears on her cheeks and a terrible certainty that her academic dreams were dying. But somewhere in the house below, her father was beginning to understand that her daughter's failure wasn't academic at all. The foundation was cracking, but perhaps, just perhaps, it was Cartwright's foundation that would ultimately crumble.
Chemical equations since middle school, who dreamed of following in his footsteps, was failing the subject that had once been her greatest passion. Grace's voice came out as a whisper. "I'm stupid, Dad. I thought I was smart, but I'm not. Dr. Cartwright was right. I don't belong at Whitmore." The words hit James like physical blows. In 15 years of fatherhood, he'd never heard his daughter speak about herself with such devastating self-hatred. The girl who'd once corrected graduate students' calculations was now calling herself stupid. "That's not true," he said firmly, kneeling beside her chair. "Grace, look at me. You are not stupid. You are brilliant." "Then explain this." Grace gestured at the report card, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Explain how someone brilliant fails chemistry. Explain how I can't even understand concepts I used to love." James exchanged glances with his wife. Something was wrong here. Deeply, fundamentally wrong. His daughter didn't suddenly lose her intellectual gifts. Chemistry didn't become incomprehensible overnight. "Show me your work," he said quietly. Grace hesitated, then trudged upstairs to retrieve her graded assignments. James spread them across the table like a detective examining crime scene evidence. His wife looked over his shoulder as he began to review each paper, his expression growing darker with every page. The first test made his jaw clench. Grace's calculations were flawless. Her understanding of molecular orbital theory sophisticated enough for graduate coursework. Yet red ink bled across every page, marking errors that didn't exist. "This is correct," James muttered, pointing to a thermodynamics problem. "This derivation is elegant. Why is it marked wrong?" He flipped to the feedback sheet. "Fundamental misunderstanding of basic principles. Work lacks theoretical foundation." James stared at the comment, then back at Grace's work. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. His daughter had applied advanced theoretical frameworks with precision that would impress his MIT colleagues. Yet this demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding? "Grace," he said carefully, "walk me through this problem. Explain your reasoning." Grace's explanation was masterful, showing intuitive grasp of complex concepts and sophisticated analytical thinking. Her understanding wasn't just correct, it was exceptional. James felt rage building in his chest, hot and dangerous. He forced himself to remain clinical, examining each assignment with the same methodical approach he brought to peer review. The pattern emerged like a smoking gun. Perfect work marked down. Sophisticated analysis dismissed. Brilliant insights labeled as fundamental errors. "Sarah," he called to his wife, his voice tight with controlled fury. "Look at this lab report." Dr. Sarah Thompson leaned over the paper, her medical training making her naturally analytical. "The methodology is sound, the data analysis is thorough, the conclusions are well supported." She looked up, confused. "Why did she get a C+?" James read Cartwright's feedback aloud. "Methodology lacks sophistication. Conclusions drawn without proper theoretical foundation. Student needs to develop more rigorous analytical approach." The silence that followed was deafening. "This is bias," Sarah said quietly, her voice deadly calm. "This is systematic, deliberate bias." Grace looked up sharply. "Mom, that's not—" "Yes, it is." James's voice cut through her protest like a blade. He spread the papers across the table, creating a timeline of destruction.
Grace, your work hasn't declined. If anything, it's gotten more sophisticated. Look at these molecular diagrams. They're graduate level. This thermodynamic analysis uses principles I don't teach until advanced physical chemistry. He pulled out his laptop and opened his MIT email. I'm sending these to my colleague who chairs the chemistry department at Harvard. I want an independent evaluation. Dad, please don't, Grace begged. It'll just prove how stupid I am. Stop. James's voice carried the authority of 20 years in academia. Don't you ever call yourself stupid again. What's happening to you is not academic failure. It's something else entirely. The Harvard chemistry chair's response arrived within 2 hours, as James had known it would be. Professional courtesy among elite academics moved at light speed. James, the email began, I've reviewed the student work you sent. This is exceptional material. Sophisticated, insightful, methodically sound. If this were submitted by one of my graduate students, I'd be impressed. Whoever this student is has remarkable potential.
The grading feedback you've attached makes no sense given the quality of the work. Something is seriously wrong here. James read the email aloud, his voice shaking with vindicated fury. Grace stared at him as if he were speaking a foreign language. But Dr. Cartwright said, Dr. Cartwright lied. She's been lying for months, systematically destroying your confidence while you produced work that impresses Harvard faculty. Sarah Thompson's surgical training had taught her to spot patterns others missed. James, we need to see her other grades, all of them. I want to see if this is isolated to chemistry or part of a broader pattern. They spent the evening dissecting Grace's academic record with forensic precision. The pattern that emerged was devastating in its clarity. Exceptional performance in classes taught by teachers of color or recent hires, declining grades in classes taught by established white educators who had the power to damage her transcript. It's not all of them, James realized. It's strategic. Cartwright knows that one teacher failing a star student might be questioned, but if it's part of a pattern, if Grace is struggling across multiple challenging courses, it looks like academic decline, like she was never as capable as we thought. Grace listened to her parents deconstruct the campaign against her with growing amazement. For months, she'd internalized every criticism, believed every disparaging comment. Now, seeing the evidence laid out clinically, she began to understand the scope of what had been done to her. Why? She whispered. Why would she do this? James Thompson's expression hardened. Because you threatened her worldview. Because seeing a brilliant black girl excel in her classroom challenged assumptions she's built her career on. The truth settled over the dining room like a storm cloud. Grace Thompson hadn't been failing chemistry. She'd been systematically sabotaged by an educator who'd weaponized her authority to crush a student whose success contradicted her racist beliefs. What do we do? Grace asked. James Thompson smiled, and it wasn't pleasant. We fight back, and we use every advantage we have. Dr. James Thompson sat in his MIT office at 5 a.m., surrounded by data that painted a damning picture of Whitmore Academy's hidden prejudices. Sleep had been elusive since discovering the truth about his daughter's treatment, replaced by the methodical fury of a scientist pursuing evidence. His Whitmore alumni network had proven invaluable. Classmates, now in positions of influence, had quietly provided access to academic records, grade distributions, and faculty evaluations spanning 5 years. The pattern emerged like a mathematical proof, elegant in its terrible clarity. Black students in Dr. Cartwright's AP chemistry classes showed a consistent 23% lower grade distribution than their white peers, despite identical SAT scores and previous academic performance. The statistical probability of this occurring naturally was less than 0.001%, a smoking gun in any academic discrimination case. James pulled up another spreadsheet. In classes taught by faculty of color or recent hires, the achievement gap vanished. Black students performed at or above their expected levels, but in courses controlled by Whitmore's old guard, teachers with 20-plus years of tenure and deep institutional protection, the pattern repeated with devastating consistency. His phone buzzed with a text from his research assistant. Professor Thompson found 3 more families willing to talk. Same teacher, same pattern. James leaned back in his chair, processing the implications. This wasn't about Grace alone. Cartwright had been systematically undermining promising black students for years, and the institution had either ignored it or actively protected her. A knock on his office door interrupted his thoughts. Dr. Sarah Thompson entered, carrying coffee and wearing the grim expression she reserved for difficult surgeries. "The Chen family agreed to talk," she said, settling into the chair across from his desk. "Jessica has been keeping documentation, photos of Grace's work, copies of assignments she helped with. She's been building a case without even realizing it." James accepted the coffee gratefully. They'd been working in shifts, Sarah handling the family outreach while he focused on institutional analysis. Their dual expertise in high-stakes environments was serving them well. "There's more," Sarah continued. "I spoke with Dr. Rodriguez last night. She's terrified, but she's willing to provide testimony. She's been documenting bias incidents for 2 years, afraid to speak up because she's untenured." Cartwright has been careful, never overtly racist, always couched in academic language, lacks sophistication, insufficient theoretical foundation, needs more rigorous analysis, all subjective evaluations that provide plausible deniability.
His laptop chimed with another email, this one from a source he'd cultivated carefully, a Whitmore board member who'd been quietly concerned about the school's diversity issues. "James," the message read, "I can't provide official documentation, but I can tell you that Cartwright has received multiple informal complaints over the years. Each time, they were dismissed as misunderstandings or academic disagreements. The pattern you're suggesting, it wouldn't surprise me. We need to talk." Sarah read over his shoulder, her expression sharpening. "That's Dr. Patricia Williams. She's the board member who pushed for the diversity initiatives." "Former civil rights attorney," James added. "If we can get her on record." His phone rang, interrupting the thought. The caller ID showed Grace's number. "Dad," her voice was shaky but determined, "Miss Rodriguez wants to meet with us. She says she has something important to show us." They met at a coffee shop in Cambridge, away from Whitmore's reaching influence. Miss Angela Rodriguez looked younger than her 26 years, her hands trembling slightly as she spread documents across the small table. "I should have spoken up sooner," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I needed this job, and I knew what happens to untenured faculty who make waves." She showed her private files, careful documentation of incidents she'd witnessed over 2 years. Students of color receiving harsher criticism for identical work. Subjective grading that consistently disadvantaged minority students, comments in faculty meetings that revealed underlying biases. "She's careful," Rodriguez explained, "never says anything overtly racist, but I've seen her face when students like Grace excel. There's this hatred, like their success personally offends her." James studied the documentation with growing excitement. Combined with his statistical analysis, it painted an overwhelming picture of systematic discrimination. "Angela," Sarah said gently, "would you be willing to testify formally? We know it's asking a lot." "Yes," Rodriguez's voice grew stronger. "I became a teacher to help kids like Grace. If I stay silent, I'm complicit." That evening, James sat in his study reviewing the evidence they'd accumulated. Statistical analysis showing impossible grade distributions, testimony from affected families, documentation from a faculty witness, independent evaluation of Grace's work by Harvard professors. Grace appeared in the doorway, hesitant but hopeful. "Dad, how bad is it?" James looked up at his daughter, brilliant, resilient, scarred but not broken, and felt his resolve crystallize into something harder than diamond. "It's bad, sweetheart, but not for you, for them." He gestured at the assembled evidence.
We have enough to destroy Cartwright's career and force institutional change, but it's going to get ugly. Grace stepped into the room, her posture straighter than it had been in months. Good. I want her stopped before she does this to anyone else. James smiled, recognizing the fierce intelligence that had always defined his daughter. Cartwright had tried to break her spirit, but she'd only succeeded in forging it into something stronger. Then we go to war, he said quietly, and we use every weapon we have. The conference room at Whitmore Academy felt like a gladiatorial arena, its mahogany table reflecting the fluorescent lights as Dr. James Thompson arranged his evidence with surgical precision. Across from him sat Dr. Helen Cartwright, her composure as polished as her pearl necklace, and Principal Richard Ashford, whose nervous energy betrayed the casual confidence he was trying to project. "Thank you for meeting with us," Ashford began, his politician's smile firmly in place. "I understand you have concerns about Grace's academic performance." James opened his laptop, his movements deliberate and controlled. "I have concerns about systematic discrimination, masquerading as academic evaluation." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Cartwright's eyebrows rose in theatrical surprise, while Ashford's shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "That's quite an accusation, Dr. Thompson. I understand you're concerned about your daughter, but let me stop you there." James's voice cut through her condescension like a scalpel. He turned his laptop screen towards them, revealing a spreadsheet of statistical analysis. Over the past 5 years, Black students in your AP chemistry classes have shown a 23% lower grade distribution compared to their white peers, despite identical standardized test scores and previous academic performance. Ashford leaned forward, studying the data despite himself. "I'm sure there are explanations."
The statistical probability of this occurring naturally is 0.0008%. James's academic credentials gave his words devastating weight. In scientific terms, that's impossible unless there's systematic bias in the evaluation process. Cartwright's facade cracked slightly. Test scores don't reflect classroom performance. Perhaps these students weren't adequately prepared for the rigor of advanced coursework. James smiled, and it wasn't pleasant. "Interesting theory. Let me share some additional data." He clicked to another screen. In classes taught by faculty of color or recent hires, this achievement gap disappears entirely. Black students perform at or above expected levels. The silence stretched like a taut wire. Ashford's political instincts were clearly screaming warnings, while Cartwright's face had gone pale beneath her carefully applied makeup. "Furthermore," James continued, relentless as a prosecutor, "I've had my daughter's work independently evaluated by colleagues at Harvard, MIT, and Princeton. Their assessment? He pulled out printed emails. Graduate-level sophistication, exceptional analytical thinking, remarkable potential." He spread Grace's graded assignments across the table like playing cards, each red mark an accusation. "These same papers you've marked as fundamentally flawed have been praised by some of the most respected chemists in the country." Cartwright's composure finally shattered. "I've been teaching for 20 years. I know quality work when I see it. Perhaps your colleagues are being generous in their evaluations." The implication hung in the air like poison gas. James's eyes went cold. "Are you suggesting that Harvard's chemistry chair lacks the competence to evaluate student work? Or perhaps you're implying that professional courtesy extends to lying about academic quality?" "I'm suggesting," she said, her voice rising, "that parents often have unrealistic expectations about their children's abilities. Grace is a lovely girl, but she lacks the intellectual sophistication necessary for truly advanced work." Intellectual sophistication. James repeated the phrase as if tasting something bitter. "Can you define that term for me, Dr. Cartwright?" "The ability to think at higher levels of abstraction, to synthesize complex theoretical frameworks, to demonstrate original analytical thinking." Cartwright's answer came smoothly, rehearsed from decades of academic doublespeak.
James nodded thoughtfully, then pulled out another document. This is Grace's molecular orbital analysis of transition metal complexes. She derived these energy diagrams independently using group theory principles typically taught at the graduate level. He slid the paper across the table. Please show me the fundamental misunderstanding you marked in red ink. Cartwright stared at the paper, her face cycling through confusion, recognition, and trapped fury. The work was brilliant. She knew it, James knew it, and her silence confirmed it. Perhaps the work was copied. Students today have access to sophisticated resources. Are you accusing my daughter of cheating? James's voice carried the kind of quiet menace that made graduate students tremble. Ashford finally intervened, his political survival instincts overriding loyalty. Helen, I think we need to be very careful about unsubstantiated allegations. Unsubstantiated? Cartwright turned on the principal like a cornered animal. Richard, you've seen the quality of students we're admitting these days. The diversity initiatives are lowering our academic standards. Someone has to maintain excellence. The words hung in the air like a confession. James felt vindicated fury surge through his veins. She finally said it, finally revealed the rot beneath her polished exterior. Diversity initiatives. He repeated this slowly. Are you referring to the admission of qualified black students like my daughter? I'm referring to maintaining the standards that have made Whitmore Academy an elite institution for over a century. When students arrive unprepared for our level of academic rigor, it's my responsibility to provide honest evaluation regardless of sensitive political considerations. James leaned back in his chair, his case now sealed by her own words. Dr. Cartwright, you've just confessed to discriminatory practices based on racial bias in front of witnesses, with documentation to support a pattern of systematic prejudice spanning years. The color drained from Ashford's face as he realized the legal implications. Cartwright looked stricken, finally understanding that her prejudices had led her into a trap of her own making. I will be filing complaints with the State Education Board, the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, and Whitmore's Board of Directors. I will be sharing this evidence with local media outlets and education advocacy groups, and I will be demanding immediate remedial action from my daughter and every other student you've systematically discriminated against. Ashford's voice came out as a croak. Dr. Thompson, surely we can resolve this internally.
Resolution requires acknowledgement of wrongdoing and substantive institutional change, James replied. Are you prepared to terminate Dr. Cartwright's employment and implement comprehensive anti-discrimination policies? The question hung unanswered, heavy with implications. Cartwright sat frozen, her career imploding around her, while Ashford calculated the political and financial costs of either choice. James began packing his evidence, his movements precise and final. I'll give you 24 hours to provide a written response to my demands. After that, this becomes a public matter. As he reached the door, he turned back one final time. Dr. Cartwright, you tried to destroy my daughter because her excellence threatened your worldview. Instead, you've exposed a system of discrimination that will end your career and change this institution forever. The door closed behind him with a sound like destiny sealing shut, leaving two stunned educators to contemplate the ruins of their carefully constructed authority. The war for Grace Thompson's future had begun, and her father had just fired the opening shot. The Whitmore Academy boardroom felt like a fortress under siege, its oil paintings of distinguished alumni seeming to scowl down at the emergency meeting called in the wake of Dr. Thompson's ultimatum. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, descendant of the school's founder and chair of the board, sat at the head of the mahogany table like a queen defending her kingdom. 24 hours, she said, her voice carrying the authority of old money and older prejudices. That's what this professor has given us to capitulate to his demands. Principal Ashford shifted nervously in his chair, sweat beading on his bald forehead despite the room's controlled temperature. Eleanor, the evidence he presented was quite compelling. The statistical analysis alone. Statistics can be manipulated, Mrs. Whitmore interrupted, her steel-gray hair catching the chandelier light. Numbers shaped to support any narrative. We cannot allow one disgruntled parent to destroy a teacher's career based on mathematical conjecture. Board member Harold Cunningham, a white-haired investment banker whose family had donated the library, nodded vigorously. Exactly right. Helen Cartwright has been an exemplary educator for 2 decades. We can't sacrifice her to appease political correctness. Dr. Patricia Williams, the lone black voice on the 7-member board, cleared her throat with the authority of someone accustomed to being outnumbered. Have any of you actually examined the student work Dr. Thompson presented? Because I have, and the discrepancy between the quality of that work and the grades assigned is staggering. Mrs. Whitmore's smile was thin as razor wire. Patricia, we all appreciate your perspective on these matters, but we must consider the broader implications. If we legitimize these accusations, we open ourselves to a flood of similar claims. Every disappointed parent will blame discrimination rather than their child's academic shortcomings. The words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Williams felt the familiar weight of institutional racism disguised as reasonable concern, the polite dismissal that had followed her throughout her legal career. What you're describing, Williams said carefully, is exactly why systematic discrimination persists, because institutions prioritize self-protection over justice. Ashford pulled out his tablet, scrolling through legal briefings his attorneys had prepared overnight. The lawyers say we have defensible positions. Dr. Cartwright's evaluations follow established rubrics. Her comments, while perhaps poorly phrased, don't rise to the level of explicit discrimination. Poorly phrased? Williams' voice rose sharply. She essentially said diversity initiatives are lowering academic standards. In front of witnesses? That's not poorly phrased, that's a confession. Mrs. Whitmore leaned forward, her patrician features hardening. Helen spoke passionately in defense of academic excellence. If that's now considered discriminatory, then we've lost our way as an institution. The meeting stretched into the evening, battle lines drawn along predictable fault lines. The old guard rallied around protecting their own, while Williams fought alone for accountability. By midnight, they'd crafted their response, a masterpiece of institutional deflection. The letter arrived at the Thompson home the next morning, delivered by expensive legal letterhead that screamed establishment power. James read it aloud to his family over breakfast, his voice tight with controlled rage. The Whitmore Academy Board of Directors has completed its preliminary review of your concerns. While we take all allegations seriously, our investigation has found no evidence of discriminatory behavior by Dr. Cartwright or any member of our faculty. Grace looked up from her untouched eggs, her face cycling through disbelief and anger. They're calling you a liar. Furthermore, James continued, we must express concern about the inflammatory nature of your accusations. Dr. Cartwright is a respected educator with an exemplary record. Your statistical analysis, while superficially compelling, fails to account for numerous variables that affect student performance. Sarah Thompson set down her coffee mug with enough force to rattle the table. They're gaslighting us, making us question our own evidence.
The letter's final paragraph was a masterwork of institutional intimidation.
We strongly encourage you to reconsider your approach to this matter. Public accusations against dedicated educators not only damage reputations, but can expose families to legal consequences. We trust you will choose a path that serves Grace's best interests as she continues her academic journey at Whitmore. The threat was clear, wrapped in concern for Grace's welfare. James crumpled the letter, his jaw muscles working overtime. "They think they can scare us into silence," he said finally. "They're about to learn how wrong they are." By afternoon, the school's counteroffensive was in full swing. Ashford had called an emergency faculty meeting, framing Dr. Thompson's accusations as an attack on academic freedom. The message was clear: close ranks, protect the institution, weather the storm. Dr. Cartwright sat in the front row, her victim narrative already polished to perfection. "I've dedicated my life to education," she told her colleagues, her voice trembling with manufactured emotion. "To have my integrity questioned because I maintain high standards is devastating." Supportive murmurs rippled through the room. These were educators who'd built careers within Whitmore's protective walls, their loyalty earned through salary and prestige. Questioning the system meant questioning themselves. But not everyone was convinced. Ms. Rodriguez sat in the back, her hands clenched in her lap as she watched the institutional machinery grind into motion. She thought of Grace's tear-stained face, of the brilliant work marked down for imaginary flaws, of the other students who'd suffered in silence. After the meeting, she found herself approached by Margaret Flynn, a veteran English teacher whose Irish accent still carried traces of her immigrant roots. "Angela," Flynn said quietly, "I need to tell you something about what happened to my nephew at this school 15 years ago." The story emerged in whispers. A brilliant black boy who'd excelled in Flynn's English classes but mysteriously struggled in other subjects. Complaints dismissed, concerns ignored. A promising student driven from the school with his confidence shattered. "I should have fought harder," Flynn admitted, tears in her eyes. "I should have protected him." Similar conversations were happening across campus. Maintenance staff, administrative assistants, younger faculty, the school's invisible army was beginning to whisper truths that had been suppressed for years. Meanwhile, Mrs. Whitmore was orchestrating her own campaign. Phone calls to major donors painted the Thompson situation as an entitled parent's attempt to blame teachers for his daughter's shortcomings. The narrative was seductive. Academic standards under attack, excellence threatened by political correctness. "These people think rules don't apply to them," she confided to Richard Pemberton, whose family trust funded the school's science wing. "They use accusations of racism to avoid accountability." Pemberton, a thin man with the pallor of inherited wealth, nodded sympathetically. "Absolutely deplorable. Helen Cartwright taught my grandson, wonderful woman, high standards." The donor network activated like an immune system, protecting the institution that validated their worldview. Lawyers were retained, private investigators hired to dig into the Thompson family's background, PR firms consulted on damage control strategies. But Mrs. Whitmore had underestimated her opponent. Dr. Thompson's MIT credentials opened doors she couldn't close. His network of academic colleagues stretched across every elite institution in the country, and word was spreading through channels she couldn't control. Dr. Williams received the first call on Wednesday evening. A colleague from her civil rights days who'd heard rumors about Whitmore's situation. "Pat, I'm getting calls about your school. Faculty from Harvard, Princeton, even international universities. They're asking questions about systematic discrimination." Williams felt a spark of hope. The Thompson case. It's bigger than one case now. James Thompson's reputation in the physics community is impeccable. When someone like that makes accusations of academic discrimination, people listen. The battle was expanding beyond Whitmore's walls, dragging the school into a spotlight it desperately wanted to avoid. Mrs. Whitmore's attempts to contain the situation had achieved the opposite effect. Now the entire academic community was watching. That night, Grace found her father in his study, surrounded by legal documents and media contacts. The weight of institutional opposition had aged him visibly, but his resolve burned brighter than ever. "Dad, maybe we should just transfer schools. This is destroying our family." James looked up at his daughter, brilliant, wounded, but still standing, and felt his determination crystallize into something unbreakable.
"Grace," he said firmly, "if we run, they win, and the next student who threatens their comfortable prejudices will face the same treatment. We're not just fighting for you anymore, we're fighting for everyone who comes after." The system had struck back with all its accumulated power and privilege. But Dr. Thompson had resources they'd underestimated, allies they couldn't silence, and a righteous fury that no institutional machinery could contain. The war was escalating, and the next phase would test whether justice could triumph over entrenched power. The coffee shop in Harvard Square buzzed with the energy of academic rebellion, its tables filled with professors, graduate students, and advocates who'd answered Dr. Thompson's call. What had begun as one family's fight against discrimination was evolving into something larger, a movement to expose the hidden networks of bias that poisoned elite education. Dr. Thompson sat at a corner table, his laptop open to a secure document that read like an indictment of institutional racism. Names, dates, testimonies, evidence, all carefully cataloged by a network of allies that grew larger each day. "The pattern extends beyond Whitmore," said Dr. Jennifer Martinez, a Harvard education professor whose research focused on discrimination in STEM fields. "I've been collecting similar reports from elite prep schools across New England. The methodology is identical. Subjective grading used as a weapon, institutional protection for biased educators, systematic suppression of complaints." Denise Mitchell sat across from them, her hands wrapped around a coffee mug like it was an anchor. At 32, she was a successful consultant at McKinsey, her MBA from Wharton a testament to resilience that had carried her through years of institutional hostility. But the scars from her Whitmore experience ran deep. "Dr. Cartwright destroyed my love of science," Denise said, her voice steady but haunted. "I was going to be a chemical engineer, had early admission to MIT, but after 2 years of being told I lacked intellectual sophistication, I started believing it." She pulled out her old transcripts, the evidence of systematic sabotage that James recognized immediately. Brilliant work marked down, sophisticated analysis dismissed, a pattern of psychological warfare designed to break a promising student's spirit. "I switched to business, figured I wasn't smart enough for real science. It took years of therapy to understand that the problem wasn't my intelligence, it was her racism." James felt rage burning in his chest as he reviewed the documents. This wasn't just about Grace anymore. Cartwright had been destroying black students' dreams for over a decade, and the institution had enabled every moment of it. "How many others?" he asked quietly. Dr. Martinez consulted her tablet. "We've identified 17 former students with similar experiences across 5 different schools, all black or brown kids in STEM programs, all subjected to the same pattern of biased evaluation and psychological manipulation." The scope was staggering. What James had initially seen as targeted discrimination against his daughter was actually part of a broader network, educators who'd weaponized their authority to maintain racial hierarchies in academic achievement. Ms. Rodriguez appeared at their table, having driven up from Massachusetts despite the risk to her career. Her face was pale but determined, a folder of documents clutched against her chest. "I brought everything," she said, settling into an empty chair. 5 years of observations, incident reports I was too scared to file, documentation of meetings where faculty discussed problem students in coded language." She spread the papers across the table like evidence in a murder trial.
email chains between faculty members, meeting minutes that revealed institutional bias, performance evaluations that praised Cartwright for maintaining traditional standards of excellence. "They knew," Rodriguez said, her voice shaking with suppressed anger. Administration knew about the complaints, the grade disparities, the pattern of black students leaving STEM programs. They not only failed to investigate, they actively protected her. Dr. Williams materialized from the coffee shop's entrance, her civil rights attorney instincts having led her to this gathering of rebels and truth-tellers. She scanned the assembled evidence with practiced eyes, recognizing the building blocks of a federal discrimination case. "This is prosecutable," she said without preamble. "Not just the individual instances, but the institutional conspiracy to suppress complaints and protect discriminatory practices." James looked up from a particularly damning email thread. "Patricia, what are you risking by being here?" William smiled grimly. "My board position, probably. But I didn't survive the civil rights movement to watch comfortable racism destroy kids' futures. Some things are worth fighting for." The group worked through the afternoon, building a comprehensive case that exposed not just Cartwright's individual bias, but the systemic network that enabled it. Other schools, other teachers, other administrative officials who'd chosen institutional protection over student welfare. Dr. Martinez's phone buzzed with a call from the Boston Globe's education reporter. "They want an interview," she announced. "The story's going public."
By evening, the first news articles had appeared online. Elite prep school accused of systematic discrimination against black students ran across multiple outlets, each story adding pressure to Whitmore's carefully constructed facade. The school's response was swift and predictable. A statement from Mrs. Whitmore's office painted the accusations as unfounded attacks on dedicated educators, while Ashford held a hastily arranged press conference defending Cartwright's exemplary record. But the narrative was slipping from their control. Former students were coming forward, faculty members were sharing their observations, and the academic community was paying attention in ways that couldn't be dismissed or buried. Jessica Chen watched the news coverage from her family's home in Newton, her parents hovering nervously as their daughter prepared to add her voice to the growing chorus of witnesses. "You don't have to do this," her mother said, understanding the risks that came with challenging powerful institutions. "It could affect your own college applications." Jessica thought of Grace, brilliant and broken, sitting in that bathroom stall with her confidence shattered by systematic cruelty. She thought of the other students who might face similar treatment if nothing changed. "I have to," she said quietly. "Grace saved my life once by helping me understand chemistry. Now it's my turn to help her." The interview aired that night on the local news. Jessica's clear, articulate testimony about witnessing discriminatory treatment provided the kind of peer witness testimony that couldn't be dismissed as parental bias. "Grace Thompson is the smartest person I know," Jessica said, looking directly into the camera. "Her work was always perfect, but Dr. Cartwright graded her differently than everyone else. She graded her like she wanted her to fail." The impact was immediate. Whitmore's Alumni Association began receiving calls from donors expressing concern. The Massachusetts Department of Education announced a preliminary investigation. Harvard's admissions office quietly reached out to affected students to ensure their college prospects wouldn't be damaged by discriminatory grading. Mrs. Whitmore called an emergency board meeting for the following morning, her usually perfect composure showing cracks under the mounting pressure. "We are facing a coordinated attack on our institution," she told the assembled trustees, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. "These allegations threaten everything we've built here." But Dr. Williams had spent the night preparing her own offensive. She entered the boardroom with boxes of evidence, legal briefs, and the steely determination of someone who'd fought institutional racism her entire career. "Eleanor," she said, setting down her materials with deliberate precision, "we need to discuss immediate remediation, starting with Dr. Cartwright's termination." The room erupted in defensive protests, but Williams continued with prosecutorial precision. "I've reviewed 5 years of complaints that were dismissed, investigated grade distributions that show clear racial bias, and documented institutional decisions that prioritized reputation over student welfare." She pulled out a legal brief her old firm had prepared pro bono. "This is a federal discrimination lawsuit waiting to be filed. The evidence is overwhelming, the pattern is undeniable, and the institutional liability is massive." Mrs. Whitmore's face had gone ashen. "Patricia, surely we can resolve this internally." "The time for internal resolution passed when you chose to protect a discriminatory teacher rather than the students she was harming. The question now is whether this board will choose justice or destruction." The meeting dissolved into angry arguments and desperate calculations. Outside, protesters had gathered, students, parents, civil rights advocates holding signs demanding accountability. The comfortable isolation of elite privilege was crumbling under the weight of public scrutiny. That evening, Grace stood in her family's kitchen watching the news coverage of protests at her school. For months, she'd felt alone in her struggle, convinced that her failing grades reflected personal inadequacy. Now she understood that her experience was part of a larger pattern, that her pain had exposed a network of discrimination that had operated in the shadows for years. "Dad, how many other kids went through this alone?" James put his arm around his daughter, drawing strength from her resilience. "Too many, sweetheart. But because you refused to stay silent, because you fought back, that's going to change." The network was revealed, the pattern exposed, the comfortable lies stripped away. Tomorrow would bring the final battle, a public reckoning that would determine whether institutional power could triumph over documented truth. But tonight, Grace Thompson stood surrounded by allies she'd never known she had, understanding for the first time that her voice had become part of something larger than herself. The fight was no longer just about her grades or her future. It was about every student who would walk Whitmore's halls after her.
The system's secret was out, and there would be no going back to the comfortable darkness where discrimination thrived. The Whitmore Academy auditorium had been transformed into a modern-day courtroom, its mahogany-paneled walls echoing with the tension of a community divided. Local news vans lined the parking lot, their satellite dishes reaching toward a gray October sky that seemed to mirror the school's uncertain future. Inside, every seat was filled. Parents, students, faculty, and community members drawn by the promise of a public reckoning years in the making. Grace Thompson sat in the front row beside her parents, her hands folded in her lap with the composure of someone who'd learned to find strength in truth. Behind them, the auditorium buzzed with whispered conversations and nervous energy as Whitmore's community prepared to confront the comfortable lies that had shaped their institution. At the front of the room, the 7-member school board sat like judges at a tribunal, their faces masks of institutional gravity. Ms. Eleanor Whitmore occupied the center chair, her silver hair gleaming under the television lights, her expression revealing nothing of the internal calculations that had kept her awake for weeks. Dr. Patricia Williams sat to her right, a stack of legal documents beside her, like ammunition for the battle ahead. The civil rights attorney in her recognized this moment, the point where institutional power either embraces accountability or reveals its true nature through desperate self-protection. Principal Ashford took the podium first, his prepared remarks carefully crafted by the expensive legal team Mrs. Whitmore had retained. "We gathered today to address serious allegations against our institution and our faculty," he began, his voice carrying across the packed auditorium. Whitmore Academy has always prided itself on academic excellence and fair treatment of all students. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Dr. Thompson's evidence had been circulating for days, shared through social media and parent networks until half the community had seen the statistical analysis that exposed decades of discrimination. However, Ashford continued, we must distinguish between isolated incidents and systematic problems, between disappointing grades and discriminatory practices, between academic rigor and institutional bias. The opening salvo was clear. Whitmore would acknowledge problems while minimizing their scope, admit mistakes while protecting the core system. It was the institutional playbook, refined through decades of similar crises. Dr. Williams leaned into her microphone. Mr. Ashford, before we hear testimony, I think the community deserves to understand the scope of evidence we're examining. She gestured to James Thompson, who rose with the quiet confidence of someone whose credentials couldn't be questioned or dismissed. He approached the podium carrying a tablet loaded with months of methodical research. Over the past 5 years, James began, his voice carrying the authority of MIT's faculty lounge, Black students in Dr. Cartwright's advanced placement chemistry classes have shown a 23% lower grade distribution compared with their white peers, despite identical SAT scores and previous academic performance. He clicked to his next slide, the data projected on screens throughout the auditorium. The statistical probability of this occurring naturally is less than 1 in 1,000, essentially impossible without systematic bias in evaluation. Gasps echoed through the room as parents processed the implications. Mrs. Whitmore's face remained carefully neutral, but her knuckles had gone white where she gripped her gavel. Furthermore, James continued, his voice rising with controlled passion, independent evaluation of student work by faculty at Harvard, Princeton, and Stanford has confirmed that papers marked as fundamentally flawed by Dr. Cartwright demonstrate graduate-level sophistication and analytical thinking. He pulled up examples on the screen. Grace's molecular orbital diagrams, her thermodynamic calculations, her sophisticated analysis of chemical kinetics. The contrast between her brilliant work and Cartwright's harsh evaluations was stark and undeniable. This is not about one teacher having high standards, James said, his voice rising with controlled passion. This is about systematic discrimination disguised as academic rigor, designed to suppress the achievement of Black students in STEM fields. The auditorium erupted in voices, some supportive, others defensive, the community's racial fault lines exposed under television lights. Mrs. Whitmore banged her gavel repeatedly, fighting to maintain control of a process that was slipping away from institutional management. Dr. Thompson, she said when quiet was restored, while your analysis is interesting, we must remember that grades reflect more than just test performance. Classroom participation, laboratory skills, overall academic maturity. Dr. Williams interrupted, her civil rights training making her voice cut through institutional deflection like a blade. Mrs. Whitmore, are you suggesting that Black students systematically lack academic maturity? The silence that followed was deafening. Mrs. Whitmore's face cycled through shock, anger, and calculation as she realized her words had revealed exactly the kind of thinking the evidence suggested. I'm suggesting, she said carefully, that multiple factors influence academic performance, and we must be cautious about attributing complex educational outcomes to simple explanations.
Dr. Martinez from Harvard stood in the audience, her education research credentials lending weight to her intervention. Mrs. Whitmore, pattern analysis is exactly how we identify systematic discrimination.
When one demographic shows consistent underperformance with one specific teacher while excelling with others, that's not complexity, that's bias. The momentum was shifting as academic voices joined the chorus demanding accountability. Whitmore's usual strategy of dismissing complaints as parental disappointment couldn't work when facing criticism from Harvard, MIT, and Princeton faculty. Miss Rodriguez approached the podium next, her young face pale but determined. "I've taught at Whitmore for 3 years," she began, her voice shaking slightly. "I've witnessed discriminatory practices, documented bias grading, and watched brilliant students have their confidence destroyed by systematic prejudice." She pulled out her folder of evidence, emails, meeting minutes, observations that painted a picture of institutional complicity. Faculty meetings where struggling Black students were discussed as diversity admits who couldn't handle real academic rigor. Administrative decisions that dismissed legitimate complaints as misunderstandings. A culture that protected discriminatory teachers while silencing those who tried to speak up. The auditorium was riveted as Rodriguez detailed years of suppressed evidence, her testimony carrying the weight of insider knowledge that couldn't be dismissed as external criticism. When Denise Mitchell took the microphone, her presence added historical depth to the accusations. Now 32 and successful, she represented the long-term cost of unchecked discrimination. "Dr. Cartwright didn't just give me bad grades," Denise said, her voice steady with hard-won perspective. "She convinced me I wasn't smart enough for science. I had early admission to MIT for chemical engineering. Instead, I switched to business because I believed her assessment of my intellectual capabilities." She paused, letting the weight of stolen dreams settle over the room. How many other students never pursued their passions because this institution chose to protect a discriminatory teacher rather than confront uncomfortable truths about itself? The question hung in the air like an indictment, challenging everyone present to consider their complicity in a system that had operated through comfortable silence. Grace Thompson stood to speak last, her 15 years carrying the weight of wisdom earned through institutional betrayal. The auditorium fell completely silent as she approached the microphone. Her presence represented both the damage and the resilience at the heart of this crisis. "My name is Grace Thompson," she began, her voice clear and strong. "For months, I believed I was failing because I wasn't smart enough. Dr. Cartwright convinced me that my understanding of chemistry was superficial, my analytical thinking inadequate, my academic achievements fraudulent." She pulled out her original report card, the failing grade that had started this entire battle. "This F doesn't reflect my knowledge of chemistry. It reflects an educator's discomfort with Black excellence in her classroom." The words carried devastating simplicity, cutting through institutional complexity to expose the human cost of systematic discrimination. Grace's composure, wounded but unbroken, challenged everyone present to choose between comfortable lies and uncomfortable truths. Mrs. Whitmore's final attempt at institutional defense came in the form of character witnesses for Dr. Cartwright, former students, parents, colleagues, who praised her dedication and denied any discriminatory intent. But their testimonies felt hollow against a weight of statistical evidence and documented patterns. When Dr. Williams called for the board's decision, the vote fell along predictable lines. 4 members, led by Mrs. Whitmore, voted to censure Cartwright but retain her employment. 3, led by Williams herself, demanded termination and comprehensive policy reform. The tie vote meant institutional stalemate, but the public hearing had achieved something more important. The administrative action, the darkness where discrimination thrived, had flooded with light. The secret networks exposed, the systematic nature of the problem documented beyond denial. As the crowd dispersed into the October evening, Grace Thompson stood beside her father, watching local news reporters interview community members about the hearing. The battle wasn't over. Federal investigations were pending, legal action loomed, and the fight for institutional change would continue.
But something fundamental had shifted. The pattern was exposed, the network revealed, the comfortable lies stripped away. Other schools were now facing similar scrutiny, other discriminatory teachers finding their practices under investigation. "Dad," Grace said quietly, "win or lose, this matters, doesn't it?" James Thompson looked at his daughter, brilliant, resilient, transformed by struggle into something stronger than she'd been before, and felt pride mixed with determination. "It matters, sweetheart. Every student who comes after you will benefit from what we've exposed here tonight." The reckoning had come to Whitmore Academy, and whether justice prevailed or institutional power triumphed, the truth was now part of the public record. The comfortable silence that protected systematic discrimination for decades was broken forever.
Tomorrow would bring new battles, but tonight belonged to the power of documented truth, spoken in public spaces where lies could no longer hide. The February snow fell like absolution on Whitmore Academy's campus, its pristine whiteness masking the institutional upheaval that had transformed the school over the past 4 months. Grace Thompson stood at her locker, books balanced against her hip, watching through the hallway windows as workmen installed a new bronze plaque beside the main entrance. Whitmore Academy commits to educational equity, inclusive excellence, and the full development of every student's potential. The words felt surreal after everything that had happened. The federal investigation had concluded in December with a scathing report that documented systematic discrimination not just by Dr. Cartwright, but woven through multiple departments and administrative decisions spanning nearly 2 decades. The Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights had imposed a consent decree requiring comprehensive policy reform, mandatory bias training, and ongoing federal oversight. Dr. Helen Cartwright was gone, her termination announced 3 days after the public hearing when the Massachusetts Department of Education launched its own investigation. The board had finally found the courage to act when faced with losing federal funding and accreditation, institutional self-preservation ultimately trumping loyalty to a discriminatory teacher. Principal Ashford had followed her into forced retirement, his resignation part of a broader administrative shakeup that saw 3 department heads removed and the entire guidance counseling staff retrained. Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore had stepped down as board chair, though she retained her seat with diminished influence, her genteel racism finally exposed as a liability rather than an asset. Grace pulled her AP chemistry textbook from her locker, its familiar weight now carrying different emotional significance. Miss Rodriguez had been promoted to department head, her courage in speaking truth to power finally recognized and rewarded. Under her leadership, the chemistry program was being rebuilt from the ground up. New curricula, revised grading standards, and a culture that celebrated intellectual curiosity over institutional conformity. "Grace," Jessica Chen's voice carried down the hallway, her approach accompanied by the kind of easy smile that had been missing from both their faces for most of junior year. "Ready for the college counseling meeting?" Grace nodded, shouldering her backpack with movements that had regained their confident fluidity. The meeting was a formality at this point. Her corrected transcripts show the academic excellence that had always been there, hidden under layers of discriminatory evaluation. MIT had not only maintained her early admission acceptance, but had reached out personally to ensure they understood their commitment to her success. Dr. Patricia Williams, now serving as interim principal while the search for permanent leadership continued, had overseen the painstaking process of reviewing and correcting years of potentially biased grades. Grace's chemistry marks had been adjusted upward by an entire letter grade on average, her overall GPA restored to levels that reflected her actual academic performance. But the numbers only told part of the story. The real victory was visible in the way Grace carried herself. Shoulders straight, voice clear, intellectual confidence fully restored. The girl who had once called herself stupid now mentored younger students in advanced chemistry, Her experience with systematic discrimination transformed into protective advocacy for others. They walked together toward the main office, passing walls now decorated with portraits of diverse scientists and mathematicians whose achievements had been overlooked by traditional curricula. The changes at Whitmore went deeper than symbolism. Enrollment had shifted, as families of color previously discouraged by the school's reputation began to see it as a place where their children could truly thrive. Dr. Williams greeted them in her temporary office. Her transformation from board member to administrator reflected the broader institutional evolution. As a civil rights attorney, she understood that meaningful change required more than policy adjustments. It demanded cultural transformation that reached into every classroom, every evaluation, every interaction between faculty and students. "Grace," she said warmly, "I have some updates from the admissions office. MIT wants to discuss their summer research program for incoming students. Apparently, your application essay about systematic discrimination in STEM education made quite an impression." Grace's essay had been unflinching in its analysis of her experience, using her ordeal with Dr. Cartwright as a lens to examine broader patterns of bias that discourage students of color from pursuing scientific careers. Rather than portraying herself as a victim, she had positioned her survival and success as preparation for a lifetime of advocacy and reform. "There's more," Dr. Williams continued, pulling out a folder thick with correspondence. "Your story has resonated beyond our community. I've received calls from school districts in California, Texas, Florida, administrators who want to implement the reforms we've developed here." The ripple effects continued to spread in ways none of them had anticipated. Dr. Thompson's statistical analysis had become a model for identifying discriminatory practices in other institutions. His methodology was being adopted by researchers across the country, turning individual outrage into systematic tools for institutional accountability. Dr. Rodriguez knocked on the office door, joining them with the kind of confident smile that came from surviving institutional retaliation and emerging stronger. Her promotion to department head had been unanimously supported by both faculty and students, her commitment to equity and excellence earning respect from even the most traditional educators.
"I wanted Grace to know," Rodriguez said, settling into a chair, "that 3 more families have come forward with similar experiences from other schools in the district. They're using our documentation as a template for their own investigations." The network of accountability continued to expand, each success story inspiring others to speak up about their own experiences with discrimination. What had begun as one family's fight for justice had become a movement that was reshaping educational practices across New England. Grace thought about Denise Mitchell, who had flown in from Chicago for the federal hearing in November. Seeing her former tormentor terminated and the system that had protected Cartwright dismantled had provided a kind of healing that decades of therapy couldn't achieve. Denise was now funding scholarship programs specifically for students of color in STEM fields, her McKinsey success channeled into systemic change. "Dr. Williams," Grace said thoughtfully, "I've been thinking about what I want to study at MIT. Obviously chemistry, but I want to add education policy as a minor. Maybe law school after that." The adults in the room exchanged knowing glances. Grace's transformation from victim to advocate represented exactly the kind of leadership development that made fighting institutional battles worthwhile. Her cane had been forged into purpose, her struggle transformed into strength that would benefit countless others. That sounds like exactly the kind of career path this experience has prepared you for. The intersection of scientific training and policy expertise is where real institutional change happens. They were interrupted by a knock on the door. Dr. James Thompson entered, his presence still carrying the intellectual authority that had made him such a formidable opponent to Whitmore's old guard. But his expression now reflected satisfaction rather than battle-tested fury. "Sorry to interrupt," he said, "but I wanted Grace to see this before it hits the news."
He handed her a tablet displaying a press release from the Massachusetts legislature. A new bill, nicknamed the Grace Thompson Act, would require statistical monitoring of grade distributions across demographic lines in all state schools, with mandatory investigations when patterns suggested discriminatory practices. Grace stared at the screen, her name attached to legislation that would protect thousands of students she would never meet. The girl who had once believed she was failing chemistry was now the namesake for systemic educational reform. "Dad," she said quietly, "this is incredible. But it feels weird having my name on something so big." James sat beside his daughter, his pride visible in the way he looked at her. The battle had strengthened their family bonds in ways that comfortable success never could have achieved. Sarah often said that adversity revealed character, and Grace's character had proven to be unbreakable. "Your name represents something important," he said. "It represents what happens when brilliant students refuse to let institutional bias define their worth. It represents families who fight back when systems try to crush their children's dreams." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sarah Thompson, still in scrubs from her shift at Boston Children's Hospital, but glowing with the kind of satisfaction that comes from watching institutional justice prevail. She carried a manila envelope that she handed to Grace with ceremonial gravity. "What's this?" Grace asked, though the MIT return address made the contents obvious. "Your official acceptance letter, with a full scholarship and an invitation to join their summer research program. They want you to work on a project studying bias in STEM education evaluation methods." Grace opened the envelope with hands that trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the overwhelming realization that her academic dreams were not only intact, but enhanced by her experience with discrimination. MIT didn't just want her despite her battle with institutional bias. They wanted her because of it. The letter was everything she had hoped for and more. Full scholarship, priority housing, research opportunities that would normally be reserved for graduate students. But most importantly, it represented validation from an institution that valued both her intellectual gifts and her commitment to fighting injustice. "I can't believe this is real," she whispered, reading the letter for the third time. "Believe it," Dr. Williams said firmly. "You've earned every word of that acceptance through your brilliance, your resilience, and your courage in fighting a system that tried to diminish you." As the meeting concluded and they prepared to leave, Grace took one last look around the principal's office that had once been enemy territory. The portraits on the walls had changed. Diverse faces now looked down from positions of honor, scientific pioneers whose achievements had been marginalized by traditional histories. Walking through Whitmore's halls towards the parking lot, Grace noticed other changes that spoke to deeper transformation. Students of color moved through the corridors with the kind of confidence that came from institutional support rather than institutional suspicion. Faculty conversations in doorways reflected genuine collaboration rather than defensive circling of wagons.
"Grace, before you go," she said, "I wanted you to know that we're naming the new chemistry lab the Grace Thompson Laboratory for Inclusive Scientific Excellence. The plaque will be installed next month." Grace felt tears prick her eyes, overwhelmed by the symbolic recognition of her struggle and survival. A laboratory bearing her name would remind future students that excellence could triumph over prejudice, that institutional bias could be defeated through courage and community support. "Thank you," she managed, her voice thick with emotion. "For everything. For believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself." As they drove home through the February afternoon, Grace sat in the passenger seat of her father's car, her MIT acceptance letter still clutched in her hands like a talisman. The familiar streets of their neighborhood looked different somehow, not because they had changed, but because her perspective had been fundamentally altered by the journey from victim to victor. "Dad," she said as they pulled into their driveway,
I keep thinking about all the students who went through what I went through, but didn't have parents with your credentials and connections. How many brilliant kids gave up on their dreams because no one fought for them? James turned off the engine and looked at his daughter, seeing not just his child, but a young woman whose character had been forged in institutional fire. Her concern for others, even in her moment of triumph, represented the kind of leadership that could create lasting change. That's exactly why what you went through matters so much. Your victory doesn't just benefit you, it creates pathways for every student who comes after you. That evening, the Thompson family gathered around their dining table for the first relaxed meal they'd shared in months. The legal briefs and evidence folders that had dominated the space were gone, replaced by college brochures and scholarship applications that represented hope rather than battle. Grace looked around at her parents, their faces reflecting the satisfaction that came from fighting injustice and winning. The ordeal had cost them emotionally and financially, but it had also revealed the depth of their family bonds and the power of refusing to accept systematic discrimination. "I have something to tell you," Grace said, pulling out a notebook where she'd been sketching plans for her future. "I've been thinking about what I want to do after MIT, after graduate school, after whatever comes next." She opened to a page covered with her careful handwriting. Ideas for educational reform organizations, plans for mentorship programs, designs for institutional accountability systems that could prevent other students from experiencing what she had endured. "I want to build something," she said, "not just for myself, but for every kid who's brilliant and black and tired of having their intelligence questioned by people who should be supporting their dreams." Sarah Thompson reached across the table to squeeze her daughter's hand, her surgeon's precision unable to hide the tears in her eyes. "Baby, that sounds like exactly what the world needs." As winter slowly gave way to spring, Grace Thompson prepared for her final semester at Whitmore Academy with the knowledge that her experience there had fundamentally changed not just her own trajectory, but the institution itself. Dr. Cartwright was gone, her discriminatory practices exposed, and her career in elite education permanently ended. The system that had protected her was dismantled, replaced by structures designed to identify and eliminate bias before it could damage students. But more importantly, Grace had discovered something about herself that no teacher could grade or evaluate, a core strength that had survived systematic attempts to destroy it. She had learned that intellectual gifts, once fully recognized and developed, could become tools for fighting the very systems that tried to suppress them. Standing in her chemistry classroom on a warm April morning, now taught by a professor who saw her potential rather than her pigmentation, Grace Thompson looked toward a future that stretched bright and uncompromised toward MIT, toward graduate school, toward a career dedicated to ensuring that no other brilliant student would face the institutional discrimination she had survived and conquered. The report card that nearly destroyed her dreams now sat framed in her bedroom, not as a reminder of failure, but as evidence of what systematic bias looked like when finally exposed to light. Beside it hung her MIT acceptance letter, proof that excellence, once recognized and supported, could overcome even the most entrenched prejudices. Her voice had found its power through struggle. Her future would be built on ensuring that other voices could sing without institutional attempts to silence them. The golden student had emerged from shadow, and the light she cast would guide others toward their own academic freedom. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.